And welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. Our special guest is author Paul Kengor. The book, The Devil and Karl Marx, Communism's Long March into Death, Deception and Infiltration, published by TAN, available through the EWTN Religious Catalog, EWTNRC.com, all things Catholic. Welcome, Paul, to EWTN's Bookmark. Great to see you.
Doug, it's great to be with you. I'm a big fan of the show. I've watched it for years. I catch it on Sunday mornings, and it's an honor to be a guest. Thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure having you on the show as well. I've read several of your books over the years, so it's a pleasure to finally get you on the particular program. People saw you related to this book on with Father Mitch. I know you were on with Raymond a little while ago as well. It seems like it's an important topic today when you think of the big picture, but somebody might say, you know, the devil and Karl Marx. Everybody knows, you know, Marx wasn't a great guy, but who's talking about Marx or communism anymore? But are they?
Well, unfortunately, they are. And I mean, this, communism is making a comeback like I didn't expect to see. I don't think anybody expected to see. Although, in a way, Doug, I mean, I graduated from college in 1990. So my senior year was the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I went on to graduate school, and I remember writing about the collapse of communism back then. And I've been warning people for, throughout the 90s, throughout the 2000s, throughout the 2010s, as a speaker around the country and different college campuses, that if we don't start teaching this history, if we don't teach about the horrors of communism, the genuine evils of communism, if we don't teach fellow Catholics about what our church has taught on this, going back to 1846, Pope Pius IX's encyclical Qui Pluribus, done 2 years before the Communist Manifesto was even published. If we don't teach people about this, we're going to get burned. It's going to come back to bite us. And I'll give you an example. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was 4 weeks old when the Berlin Wall fell. And went through public education. She was, I believe, baptized, maybe raised Catholic, went off to the universities, and she's a self-described socialist or democratic socialist. So people haven't learned this stuff. So when we see today polls of Americans, not just millennials, by the way, right? But Americans saying, oh, yeah, I prefer socialism over capitalism, or I think communism wouldn't be that bad, right? It talks about sharing, talks about love, spreading the wealth, or polls showing that a third of young people, and I think a quarter of all people, I have this poll right, think that George W. Bush killed more people than Joseph Stalin, right?
They even know who Joe Stalin was, right?
So shouldn't be surprised.
Well, let me ask you, so you never bought into the whole end of history approach that happened after the fall, except in some ways it was the end of history. It's the end of teaching history, apparently, in school and colleges.
Yeah, no, it's a very insightful point. And yeah, it's absolutely right. And we really, so much we've learned about the Cold War is that if there's a bad Joe in the Cold War conflict, there wasn't Joe Stalin, right? It was Joe McCarthy, right? The Hollywood 10. We've known all of their Communist Party USA 5-digit numbers since October 1947, when they were first published by Congress. And, instead they're portrayed as these kind of innocent, peace-loving progressives who were pursued by this fanged Joe McCarthy, who, by the way, was in the Senate, wasn't in the Congress, and had nothing to do with the Hollywood 10. And,
do you think sometimes with that, what happens is, and even for conservatives who are pointing out problems, if you go overboard and you exaggerate, or you too much focus on things that are unproven, you can take away from the certain things that are already true. Like you said, these people clearly said they were communists. Yes, they were. You could argue that McCarthy went a little personal later on because of certain personal situations in his own group, but he went overboard, and that gets used against him.
Well, it's interesting that you say that. I just got done talking to my students today and telling them that just as people on the left can be excessive by saying, oh, he's a fascist, right? Or even, oh, he's a racist, right? People on the conservative side are often guilty of saying, oh, you communist, right? And that kind of hyperbole and exaggeration It doesn't serve anybody well, especially when the real McCoy comes along and you say, yeah, well, actually, that group's
Right.
founder, she says that, quote, we are trained Marxist organizers. That's our ideological framework. We are super versed in ideological theories. And I've got emails from people who've said to me, in this regard, I'm speaking of Patrice Cullors of
Mm.
Black Lives Matter, and they'll say, I've told this to my child, or is in her 20s or 30s, and they say, "Oh, you're crazy. That's
Right.
not true."
Hmm.
But it is true. It's there. She has said it, but you can't blame people for being skeptical, right? Oh, mom, you called so and so a communist, right?
Right.
So when you engage in that kind of hyperbole and name calling, yeah,
Right.
it doesn't serve a positive purpose.
Right, and as you say, and as somebody myself a little bit older who lived through the 60s and the quote unquote generation gap and saw how those things went on and how a lot of the hippies then just became professors in colleges and universities because they found the commune outside didn't quite work, so they went to the university and started a commune under the label of education. But you make the point that communism's most successful form of redistribution was not wealth, which the ridiculous system fails to produce, but government orchestrated crime. You go on to say Al Capone looks like Mr. Rogers compared to Pol Pot and Nikolai Ceausescu. And that's the whole idea of historically when you look at communism. But then so many people would say to you, again, like I mentioned earlier, we're not talking about communism, we're talking about socialism, kind of like what they do in Norway and Sweden.
Right, yeah, but the truth is, no other ideology in history has produced so many body bags. It's really true, Doug. I mean, a minimum of 100 million people killed in the 20th century, and that's according to the Harvard University Press book, The Black Book of Communism. You have to take World War I deaths and World War II deaths, combine them, and probably double them, because really the total dead due to communist governments in the 20th century it could be as high as 140 million.
Right.
The Black Book uses only, I think, 20 to 25 million for the Soviet Union. Latest numbers on that, Alexander Yakovlev, who was Gorbachev's principal reformer, and by the way, described this stuff as demonic. He's one of many people who describe communism as demonic.
Right.
He said that, quote, Stalin alone annihilated 60 to 70 million people.
Right.
And the latest numbers on Mao in China, he's probably over 70 million in deaths. I think the Black Book had 62, 65 million. So I know these are a lot of numbers, but
what happens with that too is that in some ways the numbers are so large people can't comprehend them, so they kind of push them away, and say, well, okay, maybe in the past supposedly. But I thought it was interesting in the book itself. You say this book deals with the grim, disturbing militant atheism, which is a Catholic there we want to talk about, intense anti-religious elements of Marx and other founders and practitioners of communism. You say the book itself is partly a spiritual biography of the man, and you say it could be better called The Devil and Communism. Why do you say that versus the title you have with Marx's name in it itself?
Yeah, it's very true. So, I mean, I really started by looking at the person of Marx. And in a way, this is kind of, I hate to use the word brand, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I did a book called God and Ronald Reagan, God and George W. Bush. I even wrote God and Hillary Clinton. So I've done these spiritual biographies of individuals. And so I'm not going to write God and Karl Marx. He didn't believe in God, right? But Mark wrote this really disturbing poetry about the devil, plays about the devil. So in that sense, it really does fit. But I go indeed much more beyond Marx. I think there's 5 parts in the book, and the forward, the intro, part 1, part 2 are about Marx. But Doug, it's just the tip of the proverbial Siberian iceberg, right? I mean, there were so many different people involved in this, and Mikhail Bakunin, Vladimir Lenin, Stalin, the people from the Frankfurt School, Walter Benjamin, Kate Millett, later, Saul Alinsky, who's a very complicated case. Maybe we could talk about him later. I don't even know if you could really call him a communist, but he's at least a socialist. He's at least a radical. But many of them had things to say about the devil. Some of them dabbled in the occult.
Right.
I talk about Aleister Crowley and Walter Duranty, the New York Times man in Moscow. Man, that is sick stuff.
Yeah,
Really,
Durante was quite a character. There's a movie out called Mr. Jones that people should check out
yes,
about
right.
Durante's time during the Soviet Union and the false
It,
reports he was filing about what was going on in Ukraine.
they'd have to slap an X rating on it if they were to show Durante and Aleister Crowley and what they were sexually engaging in.
Right.
I mean, so much of this it goes from beyond the political and the ideological and redistribution of wealth into genuinely spiritual issues, which is why, to what you said, to bring us to the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church described communism as a quote unquote satanic scourge orchestrated by the sons of darkness. And I'm quoting there from Divini Redemptoris, which was published in the 1930s under Pope Pius XI. And that said, you need to realize that this is a fight primarily of the spiritual order, the spiritual order. So the church didn't mince words here, Doug. I mean, the church said, Ronald Reagan said to the Irish National Parliament in 1984, this is less about missiles and dollars and arms. This is a spiritual battle. And he called it an evil empire. The church was describing communist ideology as evil 2 years before the Communist Manifesto was even published.
Right. You know, you said in the forward, actually, Michael Knowles did the forward, said Ronald Reagan described a communist as one who reads Karl Marx and an anti-communist as one who understands Karl Marx. And you go on to say, he was the launching point for the assault on religion and eventually included a penetration of churches worldwide, possibly even seminaries, including within the Catholic Church and most certainly within the Protestant denominations. The infiltration had terrible success in communist countries, of course, but its tentacles also reached into the United States. And it says, you may be interested in knowing that we have preachers active in all churches who are members of the Communist Party. That's a quote from 1935. And especially what's interesting as a Catholic, we can see that there were inroads made, but it seemed like they first hit the liberal Protestant churches first. That seemed to be the first target, correct?
They did. And that quote that you just shared, Doug, that's from Earl Browder. And he's speaking at Union Theological Seminary, UTS, in 1935. Very liberal seminary. I'm a convert to the Catholic Church, actually a revert. That's a long story. But I had been in the Presbyterian Church USA, PCUSA, which is one of the mainline denominations. And among Protestants, Union Theological Seminary is very well known. But imagine that. People think about that quote from Doug. Earl Browder is saying we have actual preachers who are actual Communist Party members, not people who have been misled by the Communist Party, who are sympathizers. By the way, that's a really big number. And that's an even bigger problem.
Them, some of them are called dupes or
Dupe.
Right?
Yeah, dupes. Bella Dodd and others called them. The phrase of the day was dupes, suckers. And one of her Senate testimony, one of the senators referred to Bella Dodd's, quote, suckers list. Right. And I know people probably don't like that language, but that's the language they use. That was the language of the day, suckers and dupes.
Yeah, because many times they were good people or people who were led to believe they were caring about good things, which I think relates directly to what you were talking about earlier with Black Lives Matter, is the whole idea. Of course, Black Lives Matter. We all care about that. Of course, we want people treated fairly. The issue isn't those things. The issue is what's the organization's real goal behind all of this?
Yeah, and that's crucial. I mean, look, I've heard people say Black Lives Matter is a communist organization, right? And I said, well, okay, hold on. Let's be as fair here as we can. Communist Party USA is a communist organization. The Trotskyist Socialist Workers Party is a communist. People's World, the successor to the Daily Worker, that's a communist organization. But what was done in the past with communists in America in the early 20th century is they would create a group, a larger front group, with a name and purpose that no one could disagree with. Probably the most successful was called the American League Against War and Fascism. And, here, Doug, right? I mean, who would support war and fascism, right? The other one was the American Peace Mobilization, right? Well, yeah, we're for peace. And the biggest, again, sorry to use this language, but as Bella Dodd and others said, suckers to that were preachers, were Protestant preachers who, the communists would say, blessed are the peacemakers, right? And come. In some of these, like the original meeting for the American Peace Mobilization in New York, and I think it was December 1941, or no, 1940, had the signers of petitions, the word REV, period, reverend. Most of these people that signed up were reverend, and they realized only later that they had been suckered, they had been misled. So likewise, who would say that Black lives don't matter? Nobody would say that. And then they're really good at saying, well, if you don't support that group, well, then you must say that they don't matter. No, you need more nuance than this. I hope everybody reads this. It's from the Catholic Worker, from Dorothy Day's The Catholic Worker, and it's around 1935. And the Catholic Worker is rejecting the so-called outstretched hand of Earl Browder and the Communist Party. And I know that Dorothy Day and the Catholic Worker, to a lot of conservative Catholics, they're very suspicious of her. But this is a beautifully written editorial, Doug, where they say, do we have some things in common with you where we care about the worker and want to end poverty? Yes, yes. However, we cannot join your organization. Catholics cannot be communists because you have an atheistic, materialistic worldview. And our church has said this, and the magisterium has said that. So while, yes, we can agree with you on this, overall, we can't join you because of that. And Doug, people don't do that today. It's oftentimes like people can't critically think and really in a nuanced way balance these things and say, yeah, good there, police reform, I agree. Yeah, police abuse of anybody, terrible, I agree. But yet you say this on your website, want to eliminate the Western prescribed nuclear family structure. I can't agree with that, right? No. My church says
these are the Alinsky-like tactics that you alluded to earlier, where as soon as you say something, you are condemned. We don't get the second part out before you're already being condemned or you're being displaced or you're being canceled as part of the cancel culture. And one of the things that's interesting in the book, you really talk about the cultural aspect of this, which kind of overlaps into the religion side. Not so much an economic approach to what's going on, but this cultural approach to things in society.
Yeah, and if I may, one thing on Alinsky. Alinsky said, attack people rather than institutions because people hurt easier. Right? That was one of his rules for radicals. And I talked to a liberal Catholic friend a few years ago who said that the Catholics ought to adopt some of Alinsky's rules. And I said, no. I mean, what could be more unchristian, right, than saying attack people rather than institutions because they hurt easier? That's awful. That's not how we treat people. I mean, we treat everybody as sanctity and dignity, the imago Dei, made in the image of God. But yeah, culture. A lot of today's modern communist movement is operating not to organize West Virginia coal miners, right? Forget them. They say they're all voting for Trump, right? Pittsburgh steel workers, farmers in the Midwest, forget them. Coal miners, out, forget them. But if you go to the website of People's World, which again is the successor publication to the Daily Worker, the publication for Communist Party USA, the fascinating word there, Doug, it says that they are seeking out cultural workers, And I saw for the first time in People's World, there rather than anywhere else, the acronym LGBTQIA+. I thought, what's that, right? The A was for intersex, the A was for I was for intersex, A was for asexual, then plus includes everything else. They were pushing for same-sex marriage and a lot of the radical gender stuff at People's World long before anybody else in the progressive movement was. They were operating on the cultural front. And for an ideology that had people like Wilhelm Reich, who in the 1920s and 1930s literally wrote the book and coined the term sexual revolution. He was a Freudian Marxist. Herbert Marcuse of the Frankfurt School was a Freudian Marxist. There are sexual Marxists, there are gender Marxists, there are economic Marxists, classical Marxists. People don't understand a lot of this stuff. There are a bunch of different types of Marxists.
But part of the problem you have is a lot of these theories have become so well known that they're in the air we breathe. They're in the way people think, and we don't realize where they come from or the kind of people who develop them. One of the things I thought was interesting, you talk about Marx and the devil, the connection, whether he was possessed or just he was described in Oddball, he was a real character, obviously never took a bath, had all those carbuncles all over him, whatever he had. You know, he was a terrible person if you read his life, which is why it's important for people to understand where these ideas came from, some of these people, to realize that either they were crazy or they were very, very bad people, maybe evaluate their thinking in that way. But also you've got Hitler. Hitler kind of dealt with, he was a socialist too. They like to deny that all the time, but they talk about, but he also dealt with the occult. And a lot of these guys had certain aspects of the occult tied into their political philosophy, right?
They did. And I mean, Hitler was a pagan. Wow. And I mean, Nazi, this was the nationalist, socialist, German Workers' Party, right? I mean, socialists and workers. I mean, it doesn't exactly sound like, you know, modern laissez-faire libertarian conservative, right? And yes, some of them were into some really chilling things. I have a section where I talk about Kate Millett, who was the author of Sexual Politics. It was her dissertation at Columbia in the late 60s. And she ended up on the cover of Time magazine, which described her as the Mao Zedong of the women's movement. She was writing about taking down patriarchy. Doug, when she died maybe 2 years ago, she died in a Paris hotel room next to her wife, right?
Quote unquote,
she had left her husband years ago. She had become bisexual. She married a woman. And I quote at length someone who I've spoken to many times and interviewed, Kate's sister Mallory. And Mallory is convinced, and has said it many times, he believes that Kate was actually possessed. Actually possessed. Now, for the record, you know, I don't have the testimony of a church-approved exorcist to certify that. And I don't in the case of Marx either. And I don't say that Marx was possessed. I say that I don't know if he was possessed. I quote some people who say they thought he was possessed. But they, this goes beyond this goes beyond the ideological. This goes into the spiritual and even the diabolical.
Well, it's interesting you quote John Paul II on socialism. He dealt with it firsthand. He lived through it. He dealt with the Nazis and with the communists. He called particular attention, as you mentioned here on page 136, to Leo XIII's warning. He says the socialists encourage the poor man's envy. And I see this today in the movements of the rich and strive to do away with private property, contending that individual possession should become common property for all. John Paul II also flagged Leo XIII's admonition that socialists distort the functions of the state, create utter confusion in the community. The Polish pontiff connected this to the recent slogan that was in use at the time in the 70s, real socialism. It's kind of what we hear now, which is, oh, we're going to do it right. This isn't the old socialism, it's some new thing.
Yeah, that's a very common thing among the radical left is they'll say, well, the other side, they just did it wrong, right? So if you say to them, well, how can you do this? It doesn't work. It's never worked anywhere. It's even today, we have the tragic case of, forget a really extreme country like North Korea and Cuba. Look at Venezuela. And they'll say, well, they just haven't done it right. And worst of all are those evil millionaires or billionaires or wealthy people. They haven't shared enough of their wealth.
Right.
If we had enough money and enough power, and if you would just give it to us, we could do this. We could achieve this utopia. Yeah, that's a very common thing. And also, too, envy is one of the 7 deadly sins. I mean, it's one of the only of the 7 deadly sins, somebody once said, that doesn't even give you a moment's pleasure, right? It just makes you it makes you miserable from start to finish. And a lot of these kind of class warfare specialists, they foment envy, and that creates resentment.
And it
creates hate, but it gets people in the streets.
And that's why they're so angry. And you can't figure out how to deal with their anger, and they can't even tell you what they want out of the situation.
That's right.
You say, from socialism's mistaken concept of the nature of the person flows many mistakes, many ills. Its first cause is atheism. The denial of God deprives the person of his foundation, and consequently leads to the reorganization of society's order without reference to the person's dignity and responsibility. And that's what the church cares about, and free will.
Well, that's exactly right. And speaking of resentment and going out into the streets and what do they want? I mean, Marx had a favorite line from Goethe's Faust, and it was a line from Mephistopheles, right? Mephistopheles was the demon devil character. And the line was, everything that exists deserves to perish. Everything that exists deserves to perish. Imagine having a favorite line, Doug, right? Someone says to you, what's your favorite scripture verse, right? Marx, what's your favorite line? Everything that exists deserves to perish. And he wrote a letter to Arnold Rouge calling for, quote, the ruthless criticism of all that exists. His Opiate of the Masses essay, he writes in there that the criticism of religion is the beginning of all criticism. Robert Payne, one of his best biographers, the one who says that he thinks Marx may well have been possessed by demons. He said the only word that appears more often in Marx's writings other than the word criticism is the word abolition. Abolition of property, abolition of the family. And in fact, those words actually exist in the Communist Manifesto. Abolition of the family, exclamation mark. Even the most radical flare up at this infamous proposal of communists. Abolition. So with all of this, you really ask, well, what does he want? Oftentimes, he wants to raise the foundation. He wants to burn it all down. He wants to stand there in the embers and say, this is success. And now, my children, right, we can remake the world anew.
Right, and it's a great loss of the understanding of original sin and things like that. And as Augustine said, what's missing in our lives is not going to be satisfied by economics. And I always think when I read things like this, Benedict Rochelle once said, money doesn't make you happy, it makes you comfortable. And unfortunately, that's about all it does for you. Well, thank you very much, Paul. It's been great to be with you. Author of a must-read book, The Devil and Karl Marx, Communism's Long March into Death, Deception and Infiltration. New information, lots of interesting ideas brought forward. 10 publishers available through the EWTN Religious Catalog, EWTNRC.com. Check it out and check us out next time. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next time on Bookmark.